They say all politics is local, and local leaders should focus on people over politics. Join me, Mayor Kristine Lott, as I interview some of the longest-serving mayors in America to learn how they've supported their towns for decades. Each episode will be dedicated to an interview with a long-standing public servant to learn what inspires them, the challenges they faced, and the impact they've had on their own community. This is Mayors of Main Street. Welcome to Mayors of Main Street. I'm your host, Mayor Kristine Lott, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Kimberly L. Nelson, Professor of Public Administration and Government in the School of Government at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Professor Nelson is a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration and a member of the Center for Public Leadership and Governance, where she conducts training and provides advice on leadership and management topics. Her research on form of government, corruption, and innovation has been published in many journals, including Public Administration Review, the Review of Public Administration, and State and Local Government Review. She also recently published a book, Municipal Corruption: From Policies to People. Professor Nelson is here to share some of her deep knowledge on local government structures, the role of mayor, and how it's evolved over the years. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Would you start by just telling us briefly, how did you get into this specialty and what drew your interest?
Well, I kind of fell into the specialty of local government management. When I was getting my master's in public administration, I was more interested in the healthcare side. But I did an internship with the city of San Antonio, Texas, and the Department of Community Initiatives. And we did a lot of work bringing together nonprofits and local government. And it really opened my eyes up to the vast range of services local governments provide and how interesting on a day-to-day basis local government management is. And then when I went to get my PhD, my mentor and dissertation advisor was James Savara, who's a very well-known scholar in local government management. And so I sort of followed in his footsteps.
It's so interesting. I think that's a good sort of base question. Most people don't actually know the whole scope of government, or that the structure of your local government varies city by city, town by town. Can you give us a little bit of history on the forms of local government that we have today?
Sure. Some of the forms of government we have very interesting histories, actually. The two most common forms, which are the council manager form and the mayor council form, are actually kind of new. Originally, when we came into this country, when this country was developed, there was sort of a weak mayor council version that was available, meaning an elected body of some sort mostly ran a community, and they may or may not have had a mayor in place. And then in the early 1900s, if you recall from your history class, that was a time period when we were experiencing a lot of change in the United States, the Industrial Revolution, a lot of social situations with poverty and the growth of cities causing a lot of healthcare issues. And we realized that our cities really needed some help. They were being run primarily by political machines. So that's when we entered a real reform era in government. And in addition to what we saw at the national level, things like the Pendleton Act, at the local level, we saw new forms of government being experimented with. And the two most common reform governments at the time were the commission form of government, which was created after a major hurricane, interestingly enough, given what's happening today, in Galveston, Texas. And when the people of Galveston were not able to do everything that needed to be done post-hurricane, they came up with this new form of government they called the commission form. And today, the commission form is not very popular. You don't see it very often, but at the time, it spread around the country quite rapidly and became very popular. And interestingly enough, another point of recent history is that Portland, Oregon was the last large commission form of government left. And in 2022, they voted to change their form of government. And so they're switching over actually after this election. And so, and the council manager form is the other reform government. And the council manager form is a form of government that we see across the United States today. And it's really based in what we see in American corporate structure.
Right. In Winooski, Vermont, I'm operating in that form. So I chair the city council. We direct policy. there's a city manager sort of leading operations. And then my neighbor next door in Burlington, Vermont, they have the mayor council form with the strong mayor. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference between the two approaches?
Well, the mayor council form, as seen in the United States, differs from place to place.
Oh.
And it mostly differs according to what the role of the mayor is in that community. So what most people think of when they think of the mayor council form, or really even city government, what you see on TV, whenever there's, New York City or some big city mayor on TV, it's this strong executive, or what I call executive mayor. I don't like using the term weak and strong just because I don't think there are any weak mayors. I think that, there are different levels of formal authority of a mayor, but that any mayor can be strong no matter what their formal authority. So I like to say it's executive. And the traditional executive mayor council government is modeled after the federal and state governments, where you have separation of powers and a elected executive who runs operations in the administrative side of the house, while your legislative body, usually called the council, runs the legislative side of the house. And then in contrast, the council manager form is based in the American corporate model. And this form of government has very similar to, if you think of your corporation in the United States, you have a board, which at local government level, we usually call the council. And then you have a chief executive officer in a corporation. That would be the manager. And then you would have vice presidents in a corporation, but we have department directors. And so it's very similar to that form, and that was the model it is based off of.
And do you see benefits or risks to the two different models? Like, how would you evaluate them?
So I do a lot of research in this area. This is my primary place that I spend my time. And there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that the mayor council form of government offers advantages over the council manager form. However, there is evidence to suggest that the council manager form offers advantages. The council manager form, as a reformed model of government, was created and intended to prevent corruption. And in fact, research bears that out. My own research, I've done a lot of work in this area, bears that out. There are also fiscal benefits to the council manager form in better bond ratings, better fiscal stability, more robust rainy day fund, for example, is more common with the council manager form. We also see some advantages as far as lower conflict among elected officials. And so while some people would say there isn't a lot of evidence to say one form is definitely better than the other, there's virtually no evidence to suggest the mayor council form is superior to council manager form. And there is some evidence to suggest the opposite.
That's so interesting. I think I also read in some of your research, you described the mayors in council manager form as being more facilitative, and in the other form as being more of the visionary or policy setting. And I'm curious if you see some intersection there with the idea that there is maybe less opportunity for corruption in one form, or I wonder how much it's related to the structure versus like oversight. What do you see as some of the factors there?
Well, it's very complicated. I think you've hit on several pieces of it. I think one area is that the incentives are different for a mayor than for a manager. So what a mayor needs to do to be successful is, please the constituents. And if the mayor wants to run for re-election, they have to have supporters to give them money for the election and to give them votes. And so the incentive structure is a little different. While we would hope that the success of the community is a talking point for the mayor that the mayor can always run on and be successful with that, that's usually not enough. And there's all these political factors in play that just aren't in play for a manager. And yes, these are in play for a council manager, mayor as well. But because of sort of that separation of day-to-day responsibility, it doesn't seem to have as much influence over corruption potential. And then the incentives for a manager are, to to perform in such a way that the manager, gets pay raises, that they don't get fired, and that they have potential to go to another place eventually, perhaps if they would like to, and to a bigger, better place in some way. And so that's an incentive. And so it's administrative incentives versus political incentives. And then the oversight point, I think, is also very, very important. With separation of powers, in theory, how that's supposed to work is that the council is supposed to exercise oversight over the mayor in the executive mayor form. However, unlike in the council manager form, where the manager as chief executive has to go in front of that council 2 or 4 times a month and talk to them about what's going on in the city, the mayor doesn't really, in an executive mayor form, have that same sort of incentive to tell council everything, right? They're a separate elected person with their own staff, and so they don't necessarily let the council in on everything they're doing. They have to report on certain things under the law, but not everything. And so the level of oversight that the council is able to exercise over an executive mayor in a mayor council form is less than what they are able to exercise over a manager in a council manager form. So I think that's very important to consider.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that role in the mayor council form of council providing oversight to the mayor, because I think of that, I have that like strong mayor TV image. And what I've seen, and I'm sure there's variance town to town, but what I've seen is where that mayor will have like some veto authority over their council, something I lack in my role as a council manager form. So I've always thought of them as having a little bit more power over their council. So it's interesting to think about the oversight piece there.
Right. And some council manager mayors actually do have veto authority. It's not solely confined.
I knew it.
That's not solely. It's much more common in the mayor council form. And at the same time, there are executive mayors who actually don't have it as well. And so we see some differences across the country in that, as we do in almost every feature of local government. And so I think that the level of oversight, I mean, there's supposed to be checks and balances, right? It's supposed to work the same way our state and federal do. And I think that those checks and balances sometimes can break down because there's not full transparency. And I also want to point out one other thing about corruption and accountability. In this country, we have relied a great deal on our press to provide a level of oversight over the government, the local government. And as we're seeing declining numbers of daily newspapers, we are also seeing a decline in that oversight function from the media. And I think there are fewer and fewer independent newspapers in the country today. And if you look at the data on how corruption is often uncovered, the media have played a very significant role in these cases coming to light. And so I do think we are losing some level of oversight, external oversight that we had before.
That's a really interesting correlation that makes complete sense with that decline in media coverage and what we hear about, the sort of siloing or echo chambers being created where you're less likely to sort of get information that doesn't already fit what you're looking for. We don't have a local paper for my town. And so there's not a lot of press coverage because we are smaller. And I would say from my personal experience, what we do get is always like really exciting that we're actually being covered in local media. But I certainly think that a lot of things are missed. It's really got to be something pretty significant for it to rise. So that does seem to create more opportunity, unfortunately.
I think that's absolutely right. And there has been a push in I study change of form of government initiatives across the country, and I monitor those. And there have been a lot of narratives recently that the mayor council form will provide greater accountability due to the fact that the mayor is elected and the manager is not. And I think that's very flawed. There really is not a strong set of evidence or any evidence actually to suggest that that would be the case. First of all, unfortunately, our public don't have enough time to really pay close attention to what their local government is doing all the time. Second of all, I do think that with, as I just explained, with the breakdown in checks and balances in an executive mayor council form, that's problematic. And I think the dual accountability of the manager is really important to point out, because the manager is accountable to the public through the performance of the local government in the community, and the manager is accountable to the elected officials. And so this dual level of accountability, if the public sees a problem with the manager, they will go to the elected officials and say, hey,
They will.
this manager is a problem. And unlike a mayor who in best case scenario can be recalled through a recall provision, a manager can be fired immediately. You don't even have the power of recall for elected officials, so it's not even an option.
That's a good point. And I would add to that, it's sort of a double accountability, because I feel like the manager is also creating accountability for me as mayor, where we're working together in partnership. And if I'm doing something out of line, she's going to call me out before the public likely even notices. So there's a little bit extra check and balance, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the relationship between the mayor and the manager is a really important one. It has to be built on mutual trust and respect. And in the best of those relationships, they really make the local government function all the more better.
Absolutely. And I would add too, I think, because that person is a career professional, they just bring so much knowledge to the role that I would have to be learning on the job. And you said before with the incentives, I can tell that when the election rolls around, my manager isn't really changing course from any of their strategies and talking points. But amongst my council, I can definitely see a shift that time of year, right? When we're trying to, impress the public and carry forward our own vision. I'd be curious what, in your opinion, you think is the most important thing that people should understand about the role of their form of government and their mayor or what have you?
Well, that's a great question. I think two things. First, if your local government is holding a referendum on a change in form of government, please get educated on that and show up for the vote. So many of these form of government challenges turn on literally a handful of votes, and it's very disappointing. And I think that the second point would be that to understand that the difference between one of the differences that I haven't mentioned between council manager and mayor council is that, running a community is technically challenging. There are a lot of things that it would be hard, as you said, for someone who hasn't gotten experience in local government to truly understand. That level of knowledge that a manager brings is another level of protection against corruption and just mismanagement, because the manager understands things like internal controls and what kinds of experience are best in their department directors and those sorts of things. Those decisions are really important. And I think having a professional running your government is very important for those reasons, as well as the other ones we've already spoken about.
Yeah, I would agree with that totally. All that sort of technical and professional knowledge just brings so much more to the role. I'm curious if you've been watching what's happening in New York City with Mayor Eric Adams. I've heard that the governor could remove him. He's clearly not interested in stepping down. Just wondering if that's something common you've seen before, where a governor can remove a sitting mayor, or if there's anything else in that whole story that you're paying attention to.
We looked at 40 years of data on corruption in local government for our book, and I think it was surprising to me that there were so many elected officials who would be indicted for crimes and yet would not step down voluntarily. They just wouldn't step down. And it was a point of conflict among the other elected officials when this would happen, because they were surprised. They expected that that there would be some mechanism that they could use to have this person step down if the person chose not to step down. And so it's fairly uncommon actually to see any provision in which a local government can deal with that themselves. And so
Wow.
it would take the intervention of a governor to be able to force that person out of office. And in cases where there have been situations where a municipality has dealt with something like this, they often go and pass an ordinance after the fact so that if it happens again, which hopefully it never will, if it happens again, they will have some mechanism to remove that person.
You saw a lot of folks who were indicted not choosing to step down. Did you see any action taken by governors or state government to address that? Or does most of the time it just sort of play out?
Most of the time it plays out. They just let it go and then they deal with it after the fact if they choose to.
Interesting. I know here in Vermont, we don't have, recall process. And I want to say my town's charter says I can be removed for absenteeism on meetings, but I'm not sure it actually addresses corruption or bad behavior directly.
Yeah, and I don't know whether that's because people are just hopeful that it won't happen. I do want to point out that it's not very common that you see these really large corruption cases. And the data in our data set was primarily federal data that we were looking at. So I expect that there are a lot of very small cases of corruption that never get to the court system, never even makes the front page of the paper. And so really hard to pick up on those cases. But as far as these really big cases like the New York case, they're not very common. And so, I want people to take heart in that local government, I think, is still the most reliable and the one to be most trusted by the public because of the mechanisms that are in place to protect the people from government corruption and bad actors.
That is very good news. Glad to hear that it's not a bigger problem than we might think. But when you have these stories, they're so big that it can feel like it is something that's more common. Are there common misperceptions you think people have about local government that you'd want to debunk?
Well, I think that the public sometimes doesn't really understand what government does. And we've gotten to this, and this is partially the fault of local governments as well. So I want to say this. Since the 1980s, public administration has really pushed this narrative that we need to treat citizens like customers and that we really need to focus on process improvement and customer service and greater efficiency. And I think this perspective of treating citizens like customers creates a transactional relationship between government and the people that government serves. And this is a problem at the local level, as you, I'm sure, know. It results in fewer people running for office. It results in fewer people volunteering for local boards. It results in lower levels of trust in government. And so all of these things we have partially caused ourselves by this transactional based relationships we've created with the people we serve as local governments. And I really want the public to start thinking of their local governments as partners in service and that they can and should play an active role in that service. So whether that's going to a board meeting once in a while or, coming out for a Parks and Rec activity or volunteering to serve on a board, I think all of these things are very, very important. And the public should take actions that go beyond just voting to really make their communities better places.
I love that. I think about the concept of government being for us and by us. I'm a member of the community. I'm your neighbor. I think at the local level in particular, just you really are part of the same community. And if you want to be a participant in that, there's absolutely ways to do it and to have that local impact. I've seen the decline in folks running or folks volunteering for sure. And it's really unfortunate. I love that message. Is there anything else that you're learning about or focusing your research on currently that you want to lift up?
Well, we are working on a number of projects right now. We're trying to, in one project I'm working on, we're trying to figure out how structure beyond local government form, but choices made at the departmental level may affect performance. And this is going to be a long range project that we're trying to work out. And we still don't have all the answers. You know, I think I mentioned to you earlier before we were on air about term limits. We don't know how term limits affect performance at the local level at all. There's not been any work done on that. So
Wow.
I'd like to do some work. I've just started collecting that data and making sure all my data is up to date on that. So I can start looking at that and comparing it to performance type variables. And so we have so many unanswered questions. And it's fascinating to me that we have more local governments in this country than any other governments, thousands and thousands of local governments in the United States, almost 10,000 local governments.
Wow.
And, but we don't study them as much as we really should. And so that's sort of my mission in my work, is to really learn more about them. And what's interesting to me is that the lessons we learn at the local level can also apply to the state and federal level in some ways.
That's really interesting to hear about. I think you're right. There's a lot more studying that could be done, a lot more information that we can get out there to the public. I found this very illuminating, and looking at some of your research and publications before this interview, I think there's a lot that all of us who are actively involved in local government could learn, as well as just the average citizen, to know what's going on in their town.
I agree.
I want to thank you again for taking the time to speak with us and bring some of this information to light. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you to everyone who is listening. This is Mayors of Main Street.